90% of you probably don't want to talk about this next sacrifice. And it's sad. It's sad because it's been misspoken about and you have been browbeat about it. But we're not going to discuss this in a traditional fashion. And I would encourage you to listen and learn as we talk about the tithe offering. What is a tithe? Literally, tithe means a tenth. The tenth. It's an offering of the tenth. The tithe. T-I-T-H-E. Tithe. And it's an offering of your increase. We would typically look at it and call it our income. The tithe is a tenth of our increase, a tenth of our income. And it is also one of the 7 spiritual sacrifices. And so let's look at Deuteronomy 12, 1 through 17. And I'm going to read this kind of slowly here. This is talking about a prescribed place of worship. These are the statutes and judgments which you shall be careful to observe in the land which the Lord, the God of your fathers, is giving you to possess. Okay? This is a set of statutes that you need to be careful to observe in this land that the Lord is going to give you to possess. All these days that you live on the earth, you shall utterly destroy all the places where the nations which you shall served their gods, on the high mountains and on the hills, under every green tree. So not only are you going to observe these statutes, but you're going to destroy the false gods, the worship centers of the false gods that have existed in the land that God is giving you. And you shall destroy their altars, break their sacred pillars, and burn their wooden images with fire. You shall cut down the carved images of their gods, and destroy their names from that place. You shall not worship the Lord your God with such things. In other words, you're going to worship God the way God says to be worshiped, not doing it on your own. Okay, not doing it a different way. That's the reality of what you're dealing with. But you shall seek the place where the Lord your God chooses out of all of your tribes to put his name for his dwelling place. And there you shall go. There you shall take your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, the heave offerings of your hand, your vowed offerings, your free will offerings, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks. To all these offerings, go to the place that God says. And there you shall eat before the Lord your God, and you shall rejoice in all to which you have put your hand, you and your household, in which the Lord your God has blessed you. You shall not at all do as we are doing here today, every man doing whatever is right in his own eyes. For as yet you have not come to the rest and the inheritance which the Lord your God is giving you. But when you cross over the Jordan and dwell in the land which the Lord your God is giving you to inherit, and he gives you rest from all of your enemies round about, so that you dwell in safety, then there will be the place where the Lord your God chooses to make his name abide. There you shall bring all that I command you, your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, and heave offerings of your hand, and all your choice offerings, which you vow to the Lord. And you shall rejoice before the Lord your God, and your sons and your daughters, your male and your female servants, and the Levite who is within your gates, since he has no portion nor inheritance with you. Take heed to yourself that you do not offer your burnt offerings in every place that you see, but in the place which the Lord chooses in one of your tribes, there you shall offer your burnt offerings, and there you shall do all I command you. However, you may slaughter and eat meat within all your gates, whatever your heart desires, according to the blessings of the Lord your God, which he has given you. The clean and unclean may eat of it, of the gazelle and the deer alike. Only you shall not eat the blood. You shall pour it out on the earth like water. You may not eat within your gates the tithe of your grain, or your new wine, or your oil, or the firstborn of your herd or flock, or of any of your offerings which you vow, of your free will offerings, or of the heave offering of your hand. So it is talking about this new land that they're going to inherit. And he's talking about the commands that God has and the things that you're going to do, the sacrifices that you're going to keep, the ordinance that you're going to keep, the vows that you're going to keep, and being separated from the gods of the previous inhabitants of the land. It's a separation from the other nations. It's a separation from the world. And as Christians, we are called to be separated to Christ. We are separated to Christ, away from the things of the world. Does that mean we don't witness to the world? No, that doesn't mean that. But we don't partake of their ritual. We don't partake of their sacrifice. Why? Because it's not of God. And people get a little wound up when you start telling them that God says you can do this and not this, or God says to follow this set of rules. We get all bent out of shape about that. Christianity is actually one of the easiest religions to follow because it's all about Christ. We don't have a great list of do's and don'ts. If you do follow Christ, if you do put him in control, if you do give your life to him, it's pretty simple. If you don't, it starts to become complex. And you have to start justifying all the things you're not doing. This gives a clear direction. We're going to put God first. We're going to follow God's ways. We're going to follow the vows and sacrifices that we're supposed to follow. It's very clear what we need to do. And, there's a verse in the Bible, that without a vision, the people perish. And that's true. When we don't have a plan, we tend to struggle. It doesn't matter what it is. Now, some of you are probably great cooks. I'm not. I can follow directions. I can cook whatever the box says. Do that pretty well. And I think that's the whole point. If you have a recipe, if you can follow the recipe, you can probably cook it and have it turn out pretty good if it's a good recipe. There are those that have the ability to just kind of ad-lib and figure it out and have it turn out well. I'm not. If I don't follow the recipe, it's going to be a disaster. If I do follow the recipe, it's theoretically going to turn out however the recipe intended. So clear direction. I was visited just recently by some relatives that had never been up here before in this area, and they went to, I don't remember if it was AAA. I think it was AAA, and they were going on a trip, and had to map out their whole trip. And when it came to coming from the Sacramento area to the Clear Lake area, that map that they were given by the travel, or what am I saying, roadside assistance or whatever it was, AAA, like I said, I think is what it was. When they gave them the map on how to come, they routed them over Highway 16 through Rumsey in order to get to Highway 20 and come all the rest of the way to Clear Lake. That's not the best route, and so it kind of made me realize, if we have clear direction and we have insight into why we're doing things a certain way, it really helps. If we don't have that clear direction, we don't have that insight, then we end up maybe taking the long road or the bumpy road or whatever. So laying out here a prescribed place of worship, a prescribed process, a set of things that need to be done, this is clear direction for us as Christians. Now, the Bible teaches us if you make a vow or you have a requirement by God, as we've talked about here, do it. Don't say, I'm going to do blah, 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 and then not do it. If you make a vow, God, I'm going to do this, then do it. Don't break that vow. And if there's a requirement, do it. Don't break that requirement. It doesn't go well. I told you in talking about tithe, we're going to look at this a little bit differently than traditional. And I want to first go to what I would say is one of the most common verses when someone talks about tithing. And And I also want to be really clear as I get ready to do that. I want to be really clear that in this series, Tending the Altar and dealing with this sacrifice, the tithe sacrifice, we're coming at this from a completely different perspective than when you traditionally have heard people preach on tithing. So Malachi 3:8 says, "Will a man rob God? Yet you have robbed me. But you say, in what way have I robbed you? In tithes and offerings." And so we say, well, if you're not tithing, you're robbing God. Okay? Well, how is that true? Well, tithes and offerings. Tithes are a requirement. They're a sacrifice. Offerings are beyond tithe. There's different types of offerings. We've talked about the sin offering, and we've talked about the Passover offering. We've been talking about all of those. So the tithe offering was a requirement. And so in perspective, if we look at it in perspective, we have these offerings, these sacrifices that we're bringing, and a sacrifice is, in fact, a gift. So it's this gift that I'm bringing. It's this offering that I'm bringing, and Malachi simply says, you haven't kept your vow. You haven't kept your requirement. And so we come back to, will a man rob God? Well, if, you have been robbing God because you haven't been doing this. And so we can create all kinds of guilt and, make you feel like 1,000,000 pounds of sin on a stick. Not trying to do that today. So I want to talk about the sacrifice of tithe. Now, the tithe offering is also a sacrifice of communicating to the needs of others. And I want to look for just a moment at 1 Timothy 6:18, and it says, and this is really instructions to the rich. It's part of a larger set of passages, but I want to give you this verse here. "Let them do good, they that be rich in good works, ready to give, willing to share, storing up for themselves a good foundation for the time to come, that they may lay hold on eternal life." And so the idea here is that when we tithe, we're supposed to bring it to the storehouse. The storehouse is a place where you store things up for use at a later time. And there's many different examples we could use in the Bible of quote unquote the storehouse. But the tithe is supposed to come into the storehouse. That's typically your home church. That's where the tithe is supposed to go. And how is that sacrifice of communicating to the needs of others? Well, when you bring monies into the storehouse has sufficiency so that when there is need, it can give out of that need, or out to that need. That's part of the ministry of the church. And because I think churches, not in all cases at all, but in some cases, have not managed the storehouse very well, the result has been that they didn't have to give when it was needed, or they just didn't give when it was needed. And then the world has its own solutions. So then government steps in and builds programs to help, quote unquote. The problem is that, most of the money that goes to a government program goes to the government program, not to actually helping anyone. And it's because the government in and of itself is typically not very good at those things. They like to think they are, but they're not. So the storehouse, when it's working properly, the storehouse is a place where we bring the sacrifice of tithe, and it becomes a way to communicate to the needs of others. Now, I know in this church, and I can speak about this fairly clearly, we made a decision some years ago that we were going to tithe 10% of the church income to missions. And we have had about a 500% increase in our assets as a result of that. And you say, well, that doesn't make sense. If you're giving 10% out, how are you, able to have an increase come in? And that's the great mystery of God, of tithing, and when God blesses something. So I'm not going to go into you need to do this in order to be blessed. That's not what I'm going to do with this particular lesson. But I can just tell you, as a church, that's what happened. And it's not that we didn't give to missions before, or that we even give well to missions before, but we have given between 10 and 15% of our income to missions for the last, I don't know, however many years it's been, a number of them. And we have seen an increase every year as God has blessed the church through that giving. So when you look at tithing, I know James Penny was a man who started tithing, and he was tithing 10%, and then he was blessed so much he started tithing 20%, and then he was blessed so much he started tithing 50%, and finally he was blessed so much that he was tithing 90%, because he said, well, if God could live on 10%, so could I. And you might know him better from the business that he ran, J.C. Penney. His name was James Cash Penney, but J.C. Penney, at the time of his passing, was tithing 90% of his income, because he thought it was just the best principle to have. I'm not trying to encourage you to do that either. I'm just trying to tell you that you have a requirement of a sacrifice of tithe that is a tenth. And the math is easy on that. Even people who aren't good at math can generally figure that out. If you just take the decimal point and move it one position to the left, $100 becomes 10. $1,000 becomes 100. And it makes it really, really simple. But again, just the concept of the seventh sacrifice, the sacrifice of the tithe. We've been tying these things together with, what's called the 7 sins, and loosely tying them together, not trying to make direct correlation, but I want to talk about the 7th sin for a minute, and then we'll start pulling everything together. The 7th sin is the sin of pride. And pride is defined as the excessive view of oneself without regard for others. The excessive view of one's self without regard for others, which is kind of the exact opposite of sacrifice, of communicating to the needs of others. Kind of polar opposites. Humility cures pride. A humble heart is what God's looking for. It says he resists the proud. Pride goeth before a fall. So the difference is, what do we boast of? Do we boast of self, of our own greatness, of our own accomplishment, or do we boast of God? How great is our God? Look what the Lord has done. So how do tithe and pride relate? Well, tithe recognizes our need to honor God with a tenth of our increase. Pride, on the other hand, says, I did it my way, I did it on my own, I did it myself. I don't need to recognize anybody but me. The fantastic accomplishments of me. That's what pride talks about. So humility recognizes that I'm nothing without God, and pride doesn't recognize God at all. Now, spiritual obedience, and this is something I probably taught about a lot a number of years ago. Haven't really talked about it too much lately. But spiritual obedience brings physical release. When we are spiritually obedient, there becomes a release that takes place in the natural, takes place in reality. When you are bound up in the physical, when you have things going on that you are physically feeling tied up, bound up, pushed down, oppressed, whatever, look for the thing that you can do in the spiritual that's obedient to God and God's Spirit, God's Word, and do that thing. Be spiritually obedient. Bring a sacrifice of praise. Do the communion in remembrance of Him. Speak of good things. Take every thought captive. Begin to do the spiritual things. Be obedient in the spiritual things, and you will see the release in the physical. And so when we talk about tithing a lot of times, we end up at this place where if you tithe, God will bless you. And if you don't believe me, try it. It says test Him on that. So tithe here and then see the blessing there. And if you tithe, you're going to get a blessing. And we tie the whole thing together as give to get. Right? But how about we just give to be give to be spiritually obedient? Charity and tithe. Charity, we give charitably. That empowers the local storehouse, the church, to be charitable because you bring in the tithe. Now, it would sound like to some, and it's not true, and so please don't get lost there. But it would sound like to some that, maybe we're having some financial issue in the church, and that's why I'm talking about this. And it's not. I'm simply talking about the seventh sacrifice, the tithe sacrifice. But I'm trying to help you understand how it goes together. In most churches, they really struggle because people do not tithe or do not tithe at 10%. And you've heard it said, God loves a cheerful giver. And that's true. And people get probably more wrapped around the axle on tithing than they do on anything else. And I think it's because maybe they feel guilty. And consequently, they don't know how to respond. And so they kind of lash out like, that's stupid, or I'm not doing that, or I don't believe that, or, how is it being used appropriately? Here's the great thing about tithing. Tithing is 1/10 of your income. Why? Because God said so. It's something that's a requirement. And so it's something you just do. And if you do so with a wrong heart attitude, God's not going to bless a wrong heart attitude. Why? Because it's wrong. You're saying, I know I agreed to do this. I know I'm supposed to do this, but I don't have to like it, so I'm not gonna. That's not right. We want to be sacrificial. We want to be giving praise. We want to be giving tithe. We want to be able to meet those requirements in that way. Now, the storehouse. As I said, typically the local church. Where are you vested? The storehouse, the local church. That's where I'm vested, right here. And my mom used to talk about our tithing, and she would say, it's the tithe of your increase. And we always tie that to money, but there's other things that you have that are increase. And you get up every morning and you have 24 hours, and that's a gift from God. And so what if you tithed 10% of your 24 hours? You say, well, I find it hard to pray for 10 minutes. Well, how about a couple hours? Could you do that? What if I looked at all the things that I have been blessed with, if I looked at all the things that I have and said, I need to give some percentage of that, 10% of it, to God. It kind of puts things in a whole different light, doesn't it? And what do I have to give? I mean, I have my talent, I have my time, I have my money, I have my passion. If I give 10% of all those things to God, that would be appropriate. And I'm not trying to create a guilt complex. I'm not trying to put anybody down. I'm not trying to make you feel bad. What I'm trying to tell you is that there is a sacrifice of tithe that exists. And doing that, taking care of that obligation, is simply doing what I'm supposed to do. It's no more complex than that. I'm not trying to guilt anyone when I talk about this. What I'm telling you is, give the 10th to God because it's what he asked us to do, because it's our responsibility. And if we do that, he will bless us for our obedience. He will bless us because we're doing what we're supposed to do. You know, Jesus said, if you love me, keep my commandments. Well, you know, this is keeping his word. This is doing what we're supposed to do. And we have become conditioned to do things other than what God put on us. And yet when we read here in Deuteronomy 12, the very first thing he says is, look, go to those places where there's been sacrifices to other gods and tear those places down. In other words, separate that part of your life out. Go and get rid of the old habits. Get rid of the old ways. And go back and begin to walk in the things that God has given us to do, the ordinances God has given us, the places where he's told us to worship, the places where he wants to put his name. Those are the places that we're supposed to go to. If we really want to grow in God, if we really want to see God move, if we really want those things to happen, we need to tear down the false gods. We need to tear down the false altars of sacrifice. We need to tear those things down. And so there's a little bit of maybe difficulty sometimes in letting go of something and tearing it down and replacing it with something new. But I would encourage you that as we fill in these sacrifices to God that we've talked about, the 7 sacrifices we've talked about, when we do that, God will bless. Our life will be better. Why? Because we're doing what God said. We are in line with his word. And we tear down those things that we've been holding on to falsely. Remember, the series is Tending the Altar. And in Tending the Altar, we've talked about, initially we talked about, are you just present or are you tending? Are you actually doing something to be present in the process with God, to attend to, right? It's following God's word. It's the idea that we're going to tend or to pay attention to or apply oneself to or act as an attendant of or listen to or await for God within the process of tending the altar. And the sacrifices were absolutely a key part of tending the altar. So if I'm going to do those things, if I'm going to bring the sacrifice of praise, if I'm going to, remember the Passover, if I'm going to do all these different things that we've talked about over the weeks that we've been on this topic, then I need to come to the tithe sacrifice and I need to just do it. And that would be kind of where I would leave you today, is that we need to just take care of business and just do what we need to do. We don't need to get bent out of shape about it or overly worked up about it. We just need to move ahead. And this particular sacrifice, and because of the topic that it is, I really broke this into 2 lessons. And the second lesson, which we will have for you next week, is on why tithe is not about your money. Why tithe is not about your money. And so this week we're going to just leave you with, if it's something we're supposed to do, just do it. Get it done. And then I'm going to ask you to tune in next week when we talk about why tithe is not about your money. And that's it for this week.